Hi, I'm Rajesh,
And I'm Richard.
and you're listening to Humanity.
Being human in an age of artificial intelligence.
This season, we're discussing how AI makes culture. And in today's episode, we're talking about how we are experiencing generative AI in our own lives.
So, Rajesh, this is the second to last episode of this first season.
Yeah. And we're almost to the penultimate month of the year.
It's a very penultimate moment.
Penultimate moment. There you go. Yeah.
The season has been focused on how AI makes culture. And we'll have a kind of a recap episode, the next episode, the season closer. But
Yeah, that's next week.
this episode, we're thinking about it in more personal terms. Right? In what ways have we experienced direct cultural change from generative AI?
Yeah, definitely at an individual level. Both ask what generative AI has done for you and what you can do for generative AI, right?
Right. I'm finding I like to think of generative AI as retail AI,
Uh-huh.
just in terms of thinking about what's the cultural moment that we're in and what are the effects of AI and culture. There's something distinctive about generative AI, I think, which is that each of us kind of, as long as we're someone who's literate, and owns a computer, then we have the potential to access it.
Hmm.
Which is different from kind of like with computing that started out with mathematicians and philosophers, and then it moved to research labs, and then big companies and the government had access to it. And then eventually, decades and decades, maybe a century later, then finally individual people got their own personal computers. And I kind of feel like in some ways we're at that moment with AI, that it's moved out of the realm of math and philosophy and research labs, and then maybe 15 years ago or so, at some point, it moved into big companies and the government. And now with generative AI, it's something that we can each of us use.
And I think we have, right? I know that I have, but maybe Richard, you can also say a few things about what have you done with generative AI, or if it's done anything for you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's certainly, I've been using generative AI and also kind of interested in interacting with other people in my life around it, right?
Mm.
Thinking about not only what am I doing with it, but what's the kind of discourse that I experience on a personal level, and I guess before talking about how I'm using it myself, I wanted to say a little bit about my experience of the rollout of generative AI,
Hmm.
which was really, in a lot of ways, was marked by fear.
Mm.
That a lot of people, I think, have experienced this as kind of an oh shit moment. Like, really, do we need this too? Like, we're just getting over COVID. There's all this political instability. We've got climate change, and now you're telling me that Skynet's coming, or that I'm going to lose my job. I thought being a computer programmer was safe, or whatever it
Right.
is. Like, now it kind of looks like, well, none of us, unless you were real independently wealthy or something, maybe none of that's safe. It's not clear
Yeah.
how
Yeah,
we're
you
going to
thought
be.
Matrix was a movie, but actually you're living in it.
Right. Which I think is, I don't know about what you've experienced, but I feel like a lot of people have responded to it in different ways. There's been a lot of kind of recoiling from it
Mm.
by many people, whereas some people have been excited by it and wanted to jump into it. And I think for myself, I'm actually somewhere in between a bit. Or not really in between so much as I experience both of those emotions. And
Yeah.
maybe I'm not the only one who's in this boat, but I definitely have a sense of fear around it. If there's going to be this ferocious tiger in the room with me, maybe I want to be riding it instead of
Yeah.
standing in front of it.
Yeah, it's not like when mobile phones first came, people were like, oh, what kind of ethical problems are these going to introduce? As it turns out, they introduced zillions of ethical problems.
more than any of us realized.
Yeah, right. But that fear factor was not a thing in 2006 or 7 when the first iPhone demo was made a splash. So I feel that it, we have actually matured in our understanding of technology, that it's not just a neutral thing. It has all these consequences.
Because
AI.
we've seen it in our own recent lives. We've seen new technologies coming in and having a lot of unexpected, unforeseen consequences, including negative ones.
Yeah. In a very short period of time, it's not used. You invent the steam engine and 100 years later there's a war, right? So I feel like those are good things. But
Yeah.
maybe we should get back to what's generative AI doing for Richard Russell.
Yeah. The largest impact that it's had for me is in the hat that I wear as a teacher, as a professor. It caused me to change a number of my classes, to change assignments, because so many of the kinds of assignments that have been common are just very easy
Mm-hmm.
for generative AI to answer. Any kind of summary of a text, any synthesizing and summarizing groups of texts and ideas. Generative AI is great at that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've generally tried to move assignments that are done, where students are doing it on their own,
Mm-hmm.
away from me, of changing them so that that kind of summary or
Mm-hmm.
um, synthesis is either done in the classroom where it's supervised,
Mm-hmm.
or it's not done and something else useful is done in its place, or it's done in a way that seems to be, kind of Gen AI proof. The most immediate effect for me has actually been a kind of a negative, or it's
Mm-hmm.
meant that I'm not able to do something that's useful pedagogically that used to be pedagogical.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done a lot of assignments in class. I actually haven't done any that require generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
I have done, at least with some of my teaching, talked with students about it, just to, number one, to encourage students to try it, right?
Mm-hmm.
To try to overcome this fear factor, but also to encourage them to see how they can make it useful and to describe to me what they're using it for.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the kinds of things that I've heard from students are mostly along the lines of summarizing, digesting text. Some of these kinds of things that are useful. I haven't heard about students using it for writing or
Mm-hmm.
editing. Now, that might be that they're not interested in telling me that, but I don't think so. I don't think that's the case. But I've also heard about students using it for more playful and creative purposes. Like you can have it create a poem of a specific genre or a song, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing.
Yeah. I have to say that's my experience of generative AI so far, is that it's really been a good creative companion.
Mm.
And I mean, including this podcast, right? Because when I think about it, just the two of us with no specialized tools, we're just using our regular headphones. We are using a piece of Descript, which is broadly speaking AI driven platform, but not generative AI. The fact that we can put out all of this stuff just on our own is a huge benefit. It's definitely a productivity enhancer, but I'm actually thinking that it's a creative enhancer because we just won't be able to represent ourselves in this way without having these tools.
Yeah.
And generative AI, especially in its image creation form, has done that for me. Right? I mean,
You've really used a lot of image creation. You've
yeah,
been pretty active with Midjourney, especially. Is that right?
Midjourney especially, but now ChatGPT also has Dolly built into it. So what I'm doing is something interesting where I will write some piece of text, which is written by me by hand. I'll dump that into into ChatGPT, ask it to generate some images based on it. Then I'll take the prompts that Dali uses to generate those images, not the images themselves, use those prompts, enter those into Midjourney, and then see what Midjourney produces. And it's actually often substantially better than what I would do just on my own because I'm not spending that time thinking about prompts. It's detailed prompts. It feels hacky
Hmm.
because it's not like a set procedure, but it feels like I'm able to go from an idea in my head to a document that has both words and pictures, which can be converted into video and also into a podcast without too much trouble and in a short period of time. I feel like the Rajesh and Richard media company is a possibility in a way that it just couldn't have been. The difference between us and NBC, if it was like four orders of magnitude before, now I think
Uh-huh.
it's only two.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, it's the sort of the creative tools particularly useful. I think that the image creation, the creative writing
Hmm.
is, but also really the part of what you were describing earlier is almost like a kind of a joint brainstorming process. And it reminds
Yeah.
me of our episode on AI for collaboration, how
Hmm.
one of the utilities of the generative AI tools is for externalizing your own ideas
Yeah.
and then having that kind of reflection back, right, through a slightly altered prism or an altered lens.
And maybe this is hokum. I don't know the psychology literature well enough, but there's one claim that you're more creative when you're a little bit tired, right? And so I don't know if that's really true, but
I, I hadn't heard that one. That's kind of
yeah, there's some
interested. Okay.
it, pop psychology around it. But
Uh huh.
let's say that it is true because I say it's true. And what I've found is that if I'm tired, but I'm having an imaginative thought, then I can just enter that into ChatGPT and have a conversation with it, which is like I wouldn't be able to produce 200 words of writing on it like on the spot, but in combination with ChatGPT, it can act like it's able to turn a tired person into a productive person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. By taking the thought that you are able to have in that state
Yeah,
and actually realizing it, which is something in a tired state you're generally not going to be able to do much more than jot down a note.
yeah,
But
exactly.
here, the jotting down the note as a prompt then actually can generate
There you go.
something.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. It's like you're turning scribbling notes on a napkin into a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I haven't done very much exploration with using generative AI for scientific writing or editing of my text. I think partly because I tend to spend a lot of time struggling over a small number of words, and to me, it seems like
Yeah.
a style of writing that's not it's not as helpful.
Hmm.
The kind of really just a handful of places where I have encountered some utility from it is really where I need to create some text that's more like boilerplate, but it's
Hmm.
not a kind of boilerplate that I'm used to writing all the time. So
Hmm.
there's certain classes of boilerplate that I have as part of my job, and
Right.
I keep exemplars of that style of writing, those styles of writing kind of so I can just pull up an old one. I'm just going to give you an example would be when I'm writing recommendation letters for students. I've been teaching long enough that a backlog of 15 years of those recommendation letters. And I tend to start by thinking like, okay, what is this current student that I need to write the letter for? Who do they remind me of that I've
Right.
written a letter before? And then I pull that one up and then I tweak it, right? Just to make
Right.
sure that it fits. Because I already have that, but let's say if I'm doing something that's different, maybe I'm writing some kind of personal statement or I'm writing a letter that's not, I'm writing a letter to a zoning board
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
to, it's something where I don't have 100 exemplars of this already, but it's still boilerplate, right?
Yeah.
And ChatGPT is really good at coming up with like draft a zoning board appeal or something along those kinds of lines, and it can do that for you. Yeah.
So
Kind of coming back to your question, where do we find value in AI today? Something I've generally observed almost as a in almost every situation is that to find value, it requires engaging repeatedly.
hmm.
And it's something that's been a challenge for me because typically when I try to use, let's say, one of the chatbots for
Hmm.
some task, like I have some idea, like, oh, this would be a good for a chatbot, that it pretty much never on the first try works.
Hmm.
And it often doesn't on the second try, and it may not on the third, but it's more likely to that whenever I have had some success, that it's been through repeated effort.
Hmm.
I don't know if have you do you have any experience to draw on in that respect?
Definitely with images. I mean, I think that a great deal of the value of the ChatGPT Midjourney combo, which is the two specific uses that I am most familiar with, is in querying it until you get something that you want,
Mm-hmm.
and being quite creative about taking even portions of that and getting it to do more of that.
Uh-huh. Sort of highlighting the portions that were useful
Yeah,
and drawing out more of
yeah.
that.
Drawing out more. Let's take a very common task, right? 200 words, let's say, of flowing prose that isn't spectacularly creative, but is conveying a certain point. Now, if ChatGPT gives me 100 of those, I can supply the other 100, and that is much faster. And especially again, if I'm trying to produce this at a time when I'm not feeling particularly energetic, it's just it'll happen, and it means that I got something done, which I wouldn't have gotten done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you've described at least a couple of situations or kind of contexts where you find it to be useful as an aid for creating. Have you found situations where generative AI is useful for editing or giving feedback?
I have one of the now a new kind of standard line of feedback I give is if you're writing this paragraph, ask ChatGPT to write the same thing, see which one is better, and include that. Right? Again, it's if people were highly paid professionals with 15 years of experience, maybe you don't need it. But I think it's a good tool for someone who's at the very earliest stages of their career. They don't know necessarily how best to convey a certain idea.
And probably for all of us, even if we're not at an early stage of our career, if for those of us in the knowledge economy, we often do things that we don't have a lot of experience with, that
Yeah.
are out on the edges or the penumbra of our
Hmm.
expertise.
Hmm. Yeah. I actually had that experience not too long ago because there was something I was writing where I knew I had to connect to a certain body of knowledge, but I wasn't an expert and I had to do it quickly. So I just had a conversation with ChatGPT and it gave me enough that it worked.
Hmm. Hmm.
It actually made me want to study that subject in more detail.
Uh-huh.
Right? It's not like I was like, oh, I want to pass myself off as an expert in something that I'm not, but rather I want to articulate an idea and gesture towards a certain body of work without having to master it before I write.
Right, right. I'm curious about, given that you've had a number of successes with integrating generative AI into your workflows, what does that look like for you at at an operational level? Like, do you just leave open a chatbot window on your desktop all the time when you're working? How do you integrate it into your sort of day to day?
I definitely have one Chrome tab that's got ChatGPT on it. And I have Discord because Midjourney is only available on Discord. I also have that on my desktop. So I would, yeah, I would say ChatGPT interactions at least two times a day, like just one chat, if you think of it as a discrete interaction. And Midjourney, maybe not as often, but when I do it for longer periods of time, right? So let's say
And
one or
are
two
you
times.
finding that it's something that you, in the same way that you like might Google something? Like I find often like I'm Googling something and I haven't even fully consciously thought about like, let's ask Google about this question. Like it
Yeah,
just
it's
sort of
getting there. It's
happens.
not quite there. I'm sure I Google things at least 20, 30 times a day, right? And I'm not even talking about closest pizza place kind of Googling, right? But some reference or some phrase, it's automatic now to enter it into
Yeah.
Google to see even what it throws up. I'm beginning to do something like that with ChatGPT. Not that, right? It's not like I'm not using it as a replacement for Google, but rather, oh, here's this idea. Let me just have a conversation with this thing that will not ever say no to me. So, yeah, I can't call Richard up at whatever time and, hey, Richard, what do you think? But
Sometimes I don't even say no. I just pick up the phone.
there you go. See, that's my problem. I don't
It's
want to
too late at
be,
night.
yeah, I don't want to be rejected.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. And are you replacing Google at all with the
No,
chatbot?
not yet, not yet,
Mm-hmm.
because Google is much more information seeking, and
Yeah.
chatbots haven't. At least I am still not convinced that they will tell me what is the reality when it comes to that question.
Uh huh. Uh huh. You've had
Right?
enough examples of
Yeah,
hallucination in
yeah.
areas where you already know the field.
If for example, I want to say who's the top five papers in the ethics of artificial intelligence, I would definitely type that into Google and not into ChatGPT.
Yeah. One of the first things I did in exploring, ChatGPT was asking questions where I know the answer. The hallucinations are real and
Mhm.
they happen regularly. It's not most of the
Right.
time, but it's often enough that if you don't already know the area, you could
Yeah,
be like pretty quickly
pretty
astray
astray. Yeah,
and
and
not know
that's
that you've been led astray.
and that's the biggest problem, right? Is that you don't know that you don't know, and which is plague upon our culture already. But
Yeah, yeah. What's your? I'm curious if you think that there's uh, some kind of whole that's greater than the sum of its parts in terms of generative AI and the integration of these different tools.
I just think that there's something really playful for me about being able to combine text and images and video, like be a multimedia content producer rather than a single medium content producer, and to do that in a way that feels creative and delightful, right? Like it doesn't feel like, oh, here's this one thing you're really good at, and then you suck at the other four, which is what would happen without AI. Like I feel like I'm getting to the edge of, oh, here's a new way to do intellectual labor that
Mm.
isn't just the production of text.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're getting to experience the joy of creation beyond text, beyond speech, that integrates it. For you in particular, maybe as someone who hasn't been oriented toward image production, that
Mm-hmm.
this gives you a new route into a whole new medium.
Yeah, it does, totally does. And the images, because they reflect my ideas, they are actually the images I would want to produce and not someone else's images.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that to me is is what actually is the thing. If it works, would be worth actually getting good at.
Mm-hmm. Getting good at being able to use the image generation
Not
to
just image. I
express
mean,
ideas.
meaning combining text and images, like creating something like a new literary genre, right? Which is like comics were not literature when they first started becoming popular, but now people see it as a genuine form of, they call it graphic novel for a reason, right? And so I'm thinking, what is this new medium that would feel intellectually rich and capable of expressing all kinds of ideas, but is not the same as the ones that have come before?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What new genre can we create
What
with these tools?
Yeah, I think that's, for me personally, it's still at, I would say, in the years away, time scale rather than the months or weeks, but
Right.
I can glimpse it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who knows, right? But it feels exciting. I mean, where I want to end today's episode, at least from my side, is that like my head and my heart are in different directions. Like my heart is actually excited by AI. It's my head, so to speak, that's saying, "Oh, this has got to be cautious. There are all these problems."
Mm. Just to adopt your framework there, I would say for me it's kind of flipped. That I if I had my choice, in some ways I might actually say, no, I don't really need that. I'm happy being able to just creating my own human intelligence and cultivating that. But it's more of an intellectual
Mm,
urge and almost a sense of a need, like, okay, we're kind of gonna have to do this.
hmm.
It's here.
Right.
Better make peace
Yeah.
with what it is, because to me I think there's no doubt that it's making culture and it's
It is
changing, it's
absolutely making
going to
culture.
change just about everything.
I totally agree with you. And I think that it's important for people who are, who are in the knowledge economy, broadly speaking, to get comfortable with these tools. Not necessarily very skilled. We are still, it's early days, but comfortable.
Yeah, that's a starting point, right? You
Yeah,
get comfortable first before you become skillful.
yeah,
This has been an interesting episode. Lots for me to think about, and I would like to get to the point that I think you're at, which is feeling like it's already a productive tool that's not just something that you're exploring to figure out how you can get use out of, but also getting use out of it already today.
hmm
I feel like
hmm
I'm not quite there yet. I'm still in a learning phase.
yeah. And some of it might just be tweaks in the UI, slightly different capacities that just switched. There's some threshold beyond which it will be useful. So,
You have been listening to Humanity, being human in an age of artificial intelligence. Please write to us at humanity.podcast@gmail. We'd love to hear your thoughts about AI and culture, as well as your thoughts about this podcast. Again, that's humanity.podcast@gmail.com. We'll see you next week for the final episode of Season 1, in which we continue our discussion of how AI makes culture.